It began as one of those deceptively ordinary mornings that only reveal their true weight in hindsight. The kind of morning when the sun seemed too calm, the air too still, and every neighbor's smile just a little too forced. The neighborhood had always carried an artificial gloss, the kind that comes from perfectly trimmed lawns, pressure-washed driveways, and HOA rules printed in small font booklets thick enough to rival a legal manual. For newcomers, it looked peaceful, orderly, and idyllic. But beneath the surface, that order was enforced by something far uglier, the iron grip of an HOA president who considered herself the ruler of the cul-de-sac, and whose reputation among residents was summed up by a single word whispered behind hedges and drawn curtains: Karen. Karen had carved her position out of intimidation and persistence. She was relentless with fines, merciless with rule enforcement, and shameless in the way she placed herself above everyone else. It wasn't just a position to her, it was her throne. Her clipboard was her scepter, her HOA handbook her holy scripture, and her gaze a constant surveillance camera fixed on every house within her jurisdiction. And like every tyrant, she had heirs. Chief among them was her teenage son, who carried all of his mother's arrogance but none of the restraint she pretended to maintain when facing outsiders. The morning everything started, I had rolled my Harley Davidson out of the garage, a machine that had been more than just metal and wheels to me. The bike had history. Every dent, every scratch in the chrome told a story of long rides, late nights, and journeys that stretched across state lines. It wasn't just transportation, it was a piece of my soul, an escape, and a companion. And, more importantly, it was legal, parked in my own driveway, and registered down to the last digit. But in a neighborhood ruled by Karen, legality didn't mean immunity. She had been fixated on my Harley since the day I moved in, declaring it an eyesore, claiming it violated aesthetic harmony, and even suggesting that it might encourage criminal types to loiter in our pristine little community. Every time she made one of her thinly veiled threats, I reminded her that there was nothing in the HOA bylaws that prohibited motorcycles. But for Karen, the absence of a rule was simply an invitation to invent one. Her son had taken a particular interest in my Harley. Not the respectful kind of interest one biker might show another, but the entitled curiosity of a boy who believed everything he wanted should be handed to him without question. He'd loiter by my driveway, circling the bike like a vulture. He'd ask intrusive questions, sometimes even reaching out a hand to touch it, ignoring the clear displeasure written on my face. There was a hunger in his eyes, not for the mechanics or craftsmanship of the Harley, but for possession. He didn't just admire the bike, he coveted it. On that particular morning, as fate would have it, I wasn't preparing for a ride. Instead, I was preparing for a briefing with the state attorney's office. My profession had little patience for distractions. The Harley was rolled out not because I intended to take it, but because I needed space in the garage to gather documents and equipment. My laptop bag rested against the front wheel, filled with files and notes for the case I would later present. The irony of what was about to unfold was almost too rich. While I was preparing to discuss the finer points of law and justice, my neighbor's household was preparing to trample both. I noticed the boy first, standing at the edge of my property line, arms crossed, eyes locked on the Harley like a starving dog watching a steak. His posture was expectant, as if waiting for me to do something reckless. Behind him, Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, her hair sculpted into its usual stiff helmet of authority. She surveyed the scene with a smile that was anything but warm. There was a spark in her eyes, the glimmer of someone who had found a new battle to fight. The boy made his move. He marched right up to the Harley, his voice loud, carrying across the cul-de-sac, declaring that he wanted to ride it. Not asked, not requested, but demanded. His words dripped with entitlement, as if the machine was already his, and my refusal would simply be an inconvenience for him to whine about to his mother. He didn't understand, or maybe didn't care, that this was more than property, it was a symbol. A memory, a personal possession earned through sweat and sacrifice. Karen stood by, arms folded, nodding as if her son's demand was not only reasonable but inevitable. Her presence was less about supervision and more about silent enforcement, the unspoken threat that if I dared deny her child, she would bring the full weight of her authority crashing down. And she didn't wait long. The standoff between her son's demand and my refusal lasted only moments before Karen raised her phone, her voice cutting through the quiet like a siren. She was calling the police. Her accusation? That I was endangering her child and brandishing an unsafe vehicle in the neighborhood. The claim was absurd. Bordering on theatrical, but absurdity was Karen's greatest weapon. She wielded it with confidence, knowing that sometimes the mere chaos of her accusations could drown out the truth. What she hadn't accounted for, however, was timing. Because in the midst of her fabricated emergency, I was due on a video call with the state attorney's office, a call I had already set up on the laptop propped against the Harley's wheel. As the call connected, and the faces of officials appeared on the screen, the sound of Karen's shrill voice reporting her lies to the authorities became an unintentional soundtrack to my briefing. The irony was staggering. Here I was, explaining the nuances of a case to the state attorney, while outside, my neighbor was weaving a fictional narrative designed to paint me as a criminal. The clash of realities played out in real time, and though I didn't yet know it, the collision of those worlds would set the stage for the chaos that followed. Karen had always thrived on intimidation, but this time, she had stepped into a spotlight brighter than she realized. With every exaggerated claim she made into her phone, with every demand her son shouted about my Harley, she wasn't just antagonizing a neighbor. She was building a record, creating evidence, and positioning herself against not just me, but the very system I worked within. And as the blue and red flash of police lights finally washed over the cul-de-sac, I realized the stage was set. What began as an ordinary morning had become the opening act of a battle that would drag the entire neighborhood into its orbit. The Harley was no longer just a motorcycle. It was the spark, the trigger, the centerpiece of a confrontation between law, entitlement, and the lengths some people will go to protect their illusion of control, and Karen, clipboard in hand, son at her side, phone pressed to her ear, had just lit the fuse. The wail of sirens cut through the quiet suburban air like a knife, sending shutters twitching and curtains shifting. Neighbors who normally wouldn't glance twice at one another suddenly became voyeurs, their faces pressed against windows, eager to drink in the drama that was about to unfold. This was how Karen thrived. She didn't just want victory, she wanted an audience. And today, she had one. The police cruiser rolled to a stop at the end of the cul-de-sac, its lights splashing garish streaks of red and blue across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Karen stood proudly at the center of it all, her son gripping her side, both of them wearing the smug expressions of people who believed the law existed solely to serve them. The boy pointed at my Harley like he had just uncovered contraband, while Karen's voice cut the air with exaggerated distress. Her story was polished in the way only a seasoned manipulator could polish a lie. She claimed I had waved my Harley around like a weapon, revving it menacingly, endangering her son's life. She insisted that my bike was a constant menace, a rolling hazard that had no place in a family-friendly community. And she added just enough quiver to her voice to paint herself as the protective mother standing bravely against the reckless neighbor. The officers, to their credit, didn't rush to judgment. They asked questions. They looked from Karen to me, their eyes scanning the scene. What they saw was a Harley parked motionless in my driveway, a laptop balanced against the front wheel, and me standing calmly, documents in hand, still halfway between my world of legal briefings and the circus unfolding outside. Karen didn't like their hesitation. She doubled down, waving her clipboard like it was an affidavit, citing imaginary HOA regulations that supposedly banned motorcycles, claiming that I was a repeat offender. Each lie stacked upon the last, teetering under the weight of its own absurdity, but she delivered them with such conviction that, to the untrained ear, they almost sounded believable. Almost, the boy chimed in too, parroting his mother's claims, insisting he had been nearly run over, his voice breaking into an overacted whine. He pointed again at the Harley, his demands shifting from safety to entitlement. He wanted to ride it, he said, and he couldn't understand why I had refused. To him, the refusal itself was evidence of wrongdoing. After all, wasn't everything in the neighborhood meant to be shared, regulated, and controlled by the community? But here was where Karen miscalculated. Because the entire scene, her shrill accusations, her son's entitled demands, the flashing lights, was still playing out within range of my laptop's microphone and camera. The state attorney's office, silently connected on the other end of my briefing call, had been listening, watching, observing. What Karen thought was her moment of triumph was, in reality, her moment of exposure. The officers eventually turned to me, asking for my side. Calmly, I explained. I described rolling my Harley out of the garage to make space for my files. I described the boy approaching, demanding to ride it. I recounted Karen's call to the police, her accusations, her theatrics. And then, almost as an afterthought, I gestured to the laptop, where voices from the state attorney's office chimed in to confirm that they had witnessed everything. The air shifted instantly. What had been Karen's stage was suddenly mine. The officers' posture changed. Their pens stopped mid-scribble. The neighbors at their windows leaned closer, trying to piece together why Karen's usual performance wasn't landing the way it normally did. And for the first time in years, Karen's confidence faltered. Her son tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she brushed him off. She wasn't ready to surrender. Instead, she pivoted, her voice rising again, this time turning her attack toward the broader neighborhood. She declared that if the HOA allowed menaces with motorcycles to remain, then the community itself was at risk. She claimed she spoke for everyone, that every resident wanted me gone, and that this was about preserving peace and safety, and with that, she summoned the HOA. Not officially, not with bylaws or minutes, but with the sheer power of spectacle. One by one, doors opened, neighbors emerged, some reluctantly, some eagerly. A small crowd gathered at the edges of the cul-de-sac, their murmurs rising as Karen spun her narrative to it was her greatest skill, turning her personal vendettas into community crusades. She knew how to make her problems seem universal, how to cloak her malice in the language of collective good. And for a moment, the tide threatened to turn. The murmurs of neighbors, the whispers about safety and rules, gave her ammunition, but what she didn't know was that the more she spoke, the more evidence she created. The officers were recording. The state attorney's office was recording. Even a few neighbors, phones discreetly held at their sides, were recording. Karen's empire of intimidation was finally being documented, brick by crumbling brick. When the officers stepped aside to confer, the cul-de-sac held its breath. Karen's smile returned, certain she had won. But the words that came back shattered her illusion. The officers explained that no crime had been committed. The Harley was legally parked. There were no violations of law. And any further disputes would have to be handled in civil court, not through 911 calls. Karen's face tightened. Her son stomped his foot, demanding again to ride the Harley, but the officers dismissed him with a shake of the head. The boy's tantrum echoed off the pristine houses, a sharp reminder that entitlement is loud when denied. But Karen wasn't finished. If the police wouldn't remove me, then she would. Not through force, not through the law, but through the HOA. She promised fines, hearings, sanctions. She promised to make my life miserable until I gave in. And with her clipboard clutched tightly, she marched back to her house, dragging her son behind her, already planning her next move. Of the police left, the neighbors dispersed, and the cul-de-sac returned to its unnatural calm. But the air was different now. Something had cracked. The HOA hearing was scheduled just 3 days later, though hearing was a generous word. It was less a meeting and more a stage for Karen to reassert herself, to gather her loyalists, and to dress her vendetta in the thin fabric of procedure. The notice arrived in my mailbox, typed in stiff language, accusing me of violating multiple community harmony clauses. It cited imaginary bylaws, twisted wording, and outright fabrications. The room where it was held was the same clubhouse where neighbors normally celebrated birthdays and holiday parties. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom designed by amateurs. A folding table served as the board's bench, with Karen seated in the center like a judge. Gavel replaced by her ever-present clipboard. Around her sat the other board members, a mix of allies too timid to oppose her and a few residents who were simply there for the gossip. The audience chairs filled quickly. Word of the police visit had spread, and curiosity was high. Neighbors leaned in, whispering as Karen called the meeting to order, her voice sharp and commanding. She listed my alleged offenses: the Harley parked inappropriately, the endangerment of her son, the disturbance caused by loud engines. She presented her son as a witness, his testimony dripping with rehearsed outrage. He described the Harley as a monster machine that had roared to life and nearly crushed him. The performance might have swayed the room if not for the evidence. When it was my turn, I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need theatrics. Instead, I played recordings. First, the body cam footage provided by the officers. Then, the audio captured by my laptop, where the state attorney's office had witnessed Karen's entire meltdown in real time. The room filled with the sound of her shrill accusations, her son's entitled demands, and the calm rebuttal of the police. The effect was devastating. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's allies shifted uncomfortably. Even the boy's face reddened as his own words played back, his tantrum immortalized in digital clarity. For years, Karen had relied on intimidation, her word accepted as gospel, her authority rarely challenged. But here, stripped bare by her own voice, her empire of lies cracked. She tried to pivot, of course. She claimed the recordings were taken out of context. She accused me of doctoring evidence. She insisted that even if the incident hadn't happened exactly as she described, the spirit of her complaint was valid, that motorcycles simply didn't belong in the neighborhood. But the board members, once cowed into silence, began to shift. One by one, questions rose. Why had she lied to the police? Why had she involved 911 for a civil dispute? Why had she exaggerated her son's claims? For the first time, Karen's control slipped. The neighbors who once feared her began to murmur against her. Some even spoke aloud, challenging her rulings, questioning her fitness as president. The tide was turning, and she knew it. The meeting ended in chaos. No fines were issued, no sanctions passed. The board, cornered by the weight of evidence, voted to table the matter indefinitely. Karen stormed out, her son trailing behind, their footsteps echoing down the hall like a retreating army. But even in defeat, Karen's eyes burned with defiance. She wasn't done. Not yet. Karen's downfall didn't happen overnight. People like her never collapse in silence, they thrash, they claw, they drag others down with them. But once the foundation cracks, the collapse is inevitable. The days after the hearing were filled with whispers. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid Karen now exchanged knowing glances, their courage slowly returning. Her son's tantrum had become neighborhood folklore, repeated in hushed tones with a mix of amusement and disdain. And though Karen still strutted through the streets with her clipboard, the respect, the fear, was gone. But Karen wasn't about to surrender her throne. She doubled down, filing formal complaints with the county, accusing me of noise violations, zoning violations, even suggesting my Harley was being used for illegal activities. Each claim was more desperate than the last, and each one was swiftly dismissed. But her persistence caught the attention of people she hadn't intended. The state attorney's office, already aware of her antics from that fateful call, began to investigate further. What started as curiosity turned into scrutiny. Records were pulled. Complaints were cross-checked. And soon, a pattern emerged. Karen had a long history of weaponizing her HOA position, targeting neighbors with baseless claims, and misusing emergency services. What she thought was power was, in fact, evidence of abuse. The final showdown came on a morning much like the first. The sun was calm, the air still, the cul-de-sac deceptively quiet. But instead of police cars